Welcome to Interviews from Mexico. I'm Laura Carlson, and I'll be your host as we look at cutting-edge issues with the men and women who know them best. Here on Telesur. Too often, violence against women is considered a women's issue. Obviously because it affects women, but also because it was a women's movement that first brought the problem to public awareness. Now there's a growing consensus that we cannot eradicate violence against women without the integral involvement of men, because we can't change a patriarchal culture unless we change men's attitudes as well. Today, to talk about the work around eradicating violence against women with men, we're very fortunate to have with us here in the studio José Alfredo Cruz. Thanks so much for being with us.
How are you, Laura? Thank you for the invitation.
José Alfredo is an expert on sexual violence and gender violence, and he's also a coordinator of the Latin American network MenEngage, Men Working for Gender Equality. José Alfredo, let's start with a working definition of gender violence.
We can start to conceptualize gender violence as the thoughts, beliefs, and ideas around things we've learned about what it means to be a man or a woman in our culture. In other words, we aren't educated the same. We're educated in different ways, based on sexual organography, how we're identified at birth. We're put into a series of roles, of activities, of beliefs, which determine, through socialization, including play, what we dedicate ourselves to and how we do it. It determines how we live with others, how we coexist, and how we relate with others.
That's an important definition because it goes way beyond just the fact that women are the victims of this type of violence and goes to the structure of social roles in society. How do these roles construct an acceptance or a propensity toward violence against women in societies like Mexico's, which is considered a very macho society?
The first victim of violence certainly is the perpetrator, although it's hard to see. The perpetrator is the first direct victim of the problem. Now, I'll try to explain myself. Let's visualize violence as an iceberg. An iceberg is a mountain of ice suspended in the sea. What we see in the manifestations of direct violence, like shouting, pinches, insults, blows, that's just the tip of the iceberg. And it's very serious. Every day, we hear from many victims and survivors of this kind of violence. However, it's not the most damaging type of violence. Underneath the water, we find other manifestations of violence that we can call structural violence. And finally, cultural gender violence. Structural violence is the violence that manifests itself through our economic and political models, our models of social organization, and it's directly linked to issues like public health and social justice. That kind of violence creates victims, slowly, gradually, although we often don't even realize it. And we can see it reflected, for example, when in our country, or our countries across Latin America, there are people who might die because they can't afford medication or can't get to health services in rural areas. That kind of violence is slow, gradual. It moves second to second, and it victimizes more people than the direct violence that is the tip of the iceberg. However, the thing that holds up those two types of violence, the base of the mountain of ice, is cultural gender violence. This violence, which we talked about earlier, feeds off thoughts, beliefs, and ideas, but doesn't restrict itself to the cognitive level. Because almost always, a thought ends up becoming concrete through an action. and behaviors that are legitimated by masses of people end up becoming social relations. And that's where we begin to see that the victims are men and women.
Okay, we're going to have to break this down because the first statement you made is a provocative one. You said that the first victim of violence, gender violence, is the perpetrator. And a lot of people are going to take umbrage with that statement. You explained that it's because the person who commits the violent act is responding as a result of a number of acts of violence committed against them. But you can't really mean that they're the victims in this case, or do you?
Sí.
Yes, I'll take responsibility for what I just said, even though it may have seemed irresponsible. The thing is, a perpetrator of violence is the result of a construction that he has made his own.
Luego entonces, ni siquiera ha identificado
So,
el malestar.
then, he hasn't even identified the root feeling. I don't just want to visualize the symptom. I want to look deeper. I want to look at the disease itself. And we don't have to look very far. If we look a little under the surface at a man who generates violence, what we find behind the exercise of violence is a lot of fear, a lot of insecurity. That means the first ailment of someone who exercises violence is fear and insecurity, although they themselves
Does that make him any less responsible?
Claro.
Of course, I am so afraid, I am so insecure that I need to reaffirm myself in front of someone else. I need for someone else to be afraid of me. The day that men work out fears and insecurities, we won't have to look for reaffirmation. We'll find other ways to relate to each other. That's why it's a lot more important to work with what's behind violence, not just with the symptom. And I'm not minimizing violence. It's very bad.
Or justifying.
We need to work with victims and survivors. That's clear. We need to approve the attention that we give them. But we also have to develop prevention strategies that allow men, because if we're a part of the problem, we also need to be part of the solution, that allow us to work with these ailments and take responsibility for our feelings and our actions. And that's not an easy task in Latin America.
Okay, so it's important to distinguish between the area of prevention, in which it's vital to understand what are the root causes of violence and men acting out against women in many cases, in most cases, in violent ways without justifying or making them any less responsible for their actions. So that's a very important point to clarify. Now, when we do turn to the area of prevention, what can you do, given that this is an entire social structure, as you mentioned, that causes men to be brought up in ways that foment insecurity, that foment aggression, and that end up being expressed in violence against women?
Bueno, Laura, a mí me encanta la
Well, Laura, I love the way you presented that question, because when we talk about violence, we have to be clear. I mean, nothing justifies violence, absolutely nothing. And the person who is responsible for violence is the person who inflicts it. The victim is never responsible for violence, under no circumstance, in no case. So that means it's not that I acted violently against you because you provoked me or that you earned it. I decided to act violent towards you. So violence is a decision. Then if violence is a decision, I can always decide not to act violently. But I also know other ways to relate to others, in addition to just making the decision to not act with violence. I can also decide to build relationships based on treating people well, for example. on peaceful coexistence, on appreciation for diversity, without necessarily going to live alone on a mountain. Instead, you can use your capacity to make decisions as leverage for social transformation. For example, there are things I'm not willing to give up, like going to soccer games, to a soccer stadium, or a lucha libre wrestling match. But I can go to a soccer game without yelling slogans that are misogynist or homophobic or racist. Yelling those slogans is a decision. When I become aware of that decision, I can influence a social transformation of my environment. The big problem is that we're not conscious of our capacity to decide and influence things. I mean, when I'm working with men, I always hear phrases like, "It's what society wants," or "society makes us do it," as if we are separate entities from society, with no power to influence or transform it.
And passive.
Completely separate, as if others could decide for me and determine my existence forever. And we have to be very clear about this too. Misogyny isn't destiny. I decide if I want to live with that whole construction. The first thing we need to do is start to make it visible, because what we will find is a system that legitimizes harmful ways of relating with other people. And they'll demand it from me. They'll ask me to resolve my conflicts through violence. So, as Rita Segato said,
to be a real man?
Of course. Rita Segato said, what we have to do is, we have to start to be uncomfortable, so that the other men, the ones who don't question anything, the taxi driver, the vendor in the market, so that they can start to build this state of consciousness. Because even if they are suspicious of it, they are, for now, unable to name it. Those men suspect something. When they get home and everyone is talking, everyone is chatting, everyone is laughing, everyone is playing, and dad gets home and everyone goes silent. When your kids don't talk to you anymore, when your partner doesn't talk to you anymore, it's a symptom of being isolated, because fear and respect aren't the same thing. And what we've done to families across Latin America is we've fostered in them relationships that are based on fear. And that generates a cost from a social standpoint in the family and evidently in society.
Well, how do you begin to undo that? Describe some of your work specifically, for example, with MenEngage or some of the groups that you formed to work with men here in Mexico.
To be a man in Mexico or anywhere in Latin America depends on a lot of different factors. I mean, even though all men are shaped by the same education system, you could call it the hegemonic system, dominant, patriarchal. In Mexico, we call it machismo. Even though all of us have grown up with that, there are many other factors to consider, such as race, age, and social class, which also determine how to be a man in our context. Being a man in Mexico isn't always the same. And if you're from the Yucatan Peninsula, or from a city in Mexico, or from the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, the construction of identity will be completely different.
So that's why you talk about masculinities, plural, instead of just one form of masculinity.
Some people prefer to speak in the plural. There are so many ways to construct masculinities as men across our continent. With MenEngage, what we do is we recognize the diversity of these men through culture, race, and age. And once we've recognized that diversity, we work on ways to identify what those men are suffering from. For example, how often do you go to the doctor? Do you get checkups? You just turned 40 and you haven't had your prostate checked, for example. And once men identify that as an ailment, it's a lot easier for them to get to the point of changing their behavior. What happens to us across all of Latin America is that when men come into spaces of deconstruction, It's almost always in the middle of a crisis.
What's a space of deconstruction?
I'm talking about reflection groups, groups where men can grow together, in an environment where they aren't judged, where they aren't disqualified. And it's an environment that even has the potential for bonds of friendship. Because something that is very clear to us is that if, as men, we learn unhealthy ways to relate with each other, we can also learn other ways, more constructive, healthier ways to relate with each other.
Well, how do they find out about these groups?
We promote groups all across Latin America. In Mexico, we work with a method that was developed in Costa Rica through the WEM Institute. But there are other intervention methodologies. Once a man approaches a group after a crisis, maybe because he got a restraining order against him, because he's not allowed to see his kids, because someone demanded he go to therapy, because his wife will divorce him if he doesn't, or he's already getting divorced. He approaches the group and he starts to recognize the problem. It's very common that the men will start to resolve what they think the conflict is. And as soon as they're allowed to see their kids again, or their wife decides not to leave, they abandon the process. They leave the space. The thing I just described, it's a process. It's not a space that transforms you overnight. It's a space where you need a constant commitment with yourself to maintain and get back certain things, like intimacy, that we aren't familiar with. Men don't know much about intimacy. We're not even intimate with ourselves. Some women think that men don't talk about their feelings because we don't want to share them. Why doesn't he talk about himself? Why doesn't he talk to me? Why doesn't he tell me? The reality, and I'm not trying to justify it, I'm trying to understand it. The reality is that I can't talk about those things with other people if I can't even talk about those things with myself. So I'm not even talking with myself.
The problem's much deeper than we often recognize.
They are emotional illiterates. It's an illiteracy in terms of communicating emotions. The main task is to help these men make contact with their emotions and name them so that they will be able to transform their reality.
Do most of the men come with a pretty defensive attitude, a lot of defenses against this process? You mentioned that many leave as soon as the immediate cause of their crisis is resolved. How do you keep them engaged in MenEngage?
It's not about convincing them. I mean, when they discover, when they start to take care of themselves, they start walking more. They eat better. They depend less. Because some of them can't even make themselves breakfast, who can't even iron their shirts because they don't know how. When they start to take control of these tools for self-sufficiency, you don't have to convince them. They know that the process is helping them improve their daily lives. They start to take control of themselves. So, the construction of substantive equality is a consequence of that. It's not an obsession, and it doesn't happen through an agenda where we force them. They make the agenda themselves. They take control of the transformation process because they see the real changes in their daily lives.
So it's not a job of convincing them of some new ideology or political correctness, but they begin to see that their life's better.
And even these days, there aren't very many spaces available to talk, not very many. A lot of people hear feminism and they run away. But some people stay, and some adopt a pro-feminist discourse of being allies with women. But it's a discourse that only serves to make the same mechanism of domination more subtle. You could say it's even perverse. They appropriate feminist discourse for seduction. So it just gives them tools to perpetuate the same system. That's why we need a huge commitment, a bigger commitment. It needs to be constant, and it needs to be genuine.
And through very concrete mechanisms. Well, we've talked about how you work with men who come into these groups. And you base it on what their immediate needs are and what kind of changes they can make step by step in their lives to move out of behaviors that were not just negative for the women in their lives, but also for them. What kind of work have you done on the social level, on the level of society in terms of public education? Or I noticed that at one point you had schools for gender equality. Tell us a little about that level of work.
La transformación social.
Social transformation, the rebuilding of the social fabric after the golden age of violence that we've been living through in countries like Mexico, like Colombia, for example. It can only happen with the participation of everyone. I mean,
is there an afterward? Aren't we still in a peak level of violence?
It's not a struggle for women, at least not exclusively. It's not about doing a favor for women through changing our lives. It's that by taking control of myself and making it my responsibility, I also benefit from the social transformation. We can't do anything without the help of men. Involving men has led us to build community processes outside of educational spaces.
Más allá de los espacios escolarizados.
Because we don't want to only create a few men in movement. We want to create true movements of men in our countries.
Nuestros países. Cuando son hombres en movimiento,
when it's men in movement, you can find that in the universities, in academia, almost always intellectualizing. We love intellectualizing things, theorizing, reinventing concepts. But when it isn't related to personal work, it makes no sense. So what we want to do is, we want to create community transformative spaces with health and educational professionals, but also with social actors, like promoters, as we call them, who are men from the community who are committed to their process. And once we identify them, we ask them to do something for others. So we use methodologies like the ones you've described, with popular educations and community models, where the method can be implemented when the community takes ownership of it. And it doesn't necessarily require a health or education professional. That means they aren't medical models. They're models of reflection and self-help.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like a fascinating model. And we've come to the end of the show, so unfortunately we don't have any more time to talk about it. But thank you so much for being with us. I hope we can take it up again soon. It's very important work. José Alfredo Cruz, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks a lot, Laura, and thanks to everyone here.
And thank you all. We'll be back next week on Interviews from Mexico.